Okay, so it's October already, and you know what that means, right? We are just weeks away from the 2024 election. And let me tell you, this year is shaping up to be one for the books.
It sure is. A real nail-biter.
Exactly. Everyone's on the edge of their seats, and for good reason. With those razor-thin margins we're seeing in so many states, it's anyone's game at this point. So to really get a grip on this wild ride we call an election, we're diving into some fresh data from Emerson College polling. They just released some fascinating numbers this week.
And Emerson has a pretty stellar reputation for accuracy, which is really important, especially right now when the race is this close between Vice President Harris and former President Trump.
Right. We're not exactly looking at a landslide for either candidate, are we? It's a real toss-up.
You got it. No nationwide sweep in sight, which is why everyone's laser focused on those swing states.
Ah, yes, the swing states, the ones that could swing the entire election. But for anyone who might not be familiar with the term, what exactly makes a state a swing state?
So basically, a swing state is one that doesn't have a clear partisan leaning, meaning they could realistically vote for either the Democratic or Republican candidate.
Right, they're like the wild cards of the Electoral College, keeping things interesting.
Exactly. And this year, the big ones, the ones to watch, are Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Nevada.
So those are our battleground states. And what's the situation in those states according to the Emerson data? Anything surprising?
Well, the margins are incredibly close, like really close, which isn't all that surprising in itself, but there have been some interesting shifts from even just last month.
Like what?
Well, for instance, Harris seems to have gained some ground in Georgia, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, which, could be a response to some of the recent campaign moves in those states.
Yeah, those states have been getting a lot of attention lately. Both campaigns have really been focusing their efforts there.
Exactly. It's all about strategy at this point.
But it's not all sunshine and roses for Harris, is it? Where's she struggling?
Well, her support seems to have dipped a little bit in Arizona and North Carolina, according to the data.
And any idea what's driving that decline in those particular states?
It's tough to say for sure without a deeper dive. It could be a bunch of factors. Maybe some local issues are coming into play. Maybe the opposition's campaigns are really resonating in those areas. Or, it could be something else entirely.
So a mixed bag for Harris so far. Some wins, some losses. What about Trump? How's he doing in these swing states?
So interestingly, Trump saw gains in Pennsylvania and North Carolina, but he also dipped in Georgia and Nevada.
Okay, so kind of mirroring Harris's performance in a way, at least in those particular states.
Right. But perhaps the most intriguing detail is this potential ceiling we're seeing for Trump's support in Wisconsin.
A ceiling? You mean like a limit on how much support he can get there?
Yeah, exactly. Like there's a cap on his potential voters.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting because Wisconsin has been a really important state for him in the past.
It has. He won it in 2016. Right.
Exactly. So this potential ceiling is definitely something worth keeping an eye on. There's clearly a lot going on beneath the surface there. Could be demographic shifts, specific policies, or even the emergence of third-party candidates who are drawing away some of his usual base.
Right. You can't forget about those third-party candidates. They could definitely be a wild card this year.
Yeah.
It just goes to show you can't underestimate how each state has its own unique political landscape, right? You can't just assume that national trends will always play out in the same way everywhere.
Absolutely.
And that's why analyzing these swing states is so fascinating, because they really are like little microcosms of the larger electorate.
Speaking of microcosms, one detail from the Emerson poll that really jumped out at me was the gender gap.
The gender gap. Yeah, what about it?
Well, nationally, we're seeing the usual trend of women leaning towards Harris and men leaning towards Trump, which, isn't unusual in recent elections. But then there's Arizona. They're like, hold my beer, because in Arizona, Trump is actually ahead among both men and women, according to the poll. What's happening there?
It's a perfect illustration of how local dynamics can really throw a wrench in those national narratives.
Right. Like, Arizona, what are you doing? Defying all political gravity over there.
Basically. But seriously, Arizona has its own distinct political culture, its own demographics, and its own set of pressing issues. And one issue that's particularly significant there and might be influencing voter decisions in a way we're not seeing elsewhere is immigration.
That makes sense. It's a huge issue, especially in border states like Arizona, where the impact is felt much more directly. So it seems like if we really want to grasp the nuances of this election, we have to go beyond the national polls, beyond those broad stroke narratives, and really delve into what's happening on the ground in each of these swing states.
100%. And there's even more to uncover when you start looking beyond the presidential race itself. We've got down-ballot races, propositions on the ballot, and gubernatorial ratings to consider, all of which add another layer of complexity and, honestly, intrigue to the story.
It's like every state is having its own little mini election alongside the big presidential showdown.
Right, and each with its own unique flavor.
Exactly. Speaking of which, the Emerson poll also gave us some insights into those statewide races happening in those very same swing states.
Yep, they took a look beyond just the presidential race. And it's actually pretty interesting. It seems like Democratic candidates are generally doing pretty well in those swing states.
Oh, really? So even if it's neck and neck at the top of the ticket, Democrats could still make some gains in Congress or other statewide offices.
It's definitely a possibility. For example, take the Arizona Senate race. The Emerson data has Democrat Ruben Gallego leading Republican Curry Lake by a decent margin. And we see a similar trend in Michigan, Nevada, and Wisconsin, where the Democratic Senate candidates are also ahead.
That Arizona Senate race is particularly interesting, especially given how unpredictable Arizona seems to be in the presidential election. It almost sounds like voters there might be open to splitting their tickets.
It's possible. Ticket splitting, where voters choose candidates from different parties on the same ballot, often reflects a more nuanced voter preference. Or maybe even a dissatisfaction with the choices presented by just one party.
Right. It's a good reminder that you can't just put voters into neat little boxes.
Exactly.
They're complex. They're making decisions based on all sorts of factors.
They are.
Now, before we move on from the Emerson poll, there were a couple of key issues that really caught my eye. The first is abortion access. The poll took a look at Arizona and Nevada, where voters will actually be deciding on propositions to enshrine abortion rights in their state constitutions, right?
That's right. Those propositions are on the ballot in both those states, and the Emerson data seems to indicate that a majority of voters in both Arizona and Nevada actually support them, which suggests that this issue, access to abortion, is a top concern for a significant portion of the electorate in those states.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out on Election Day, how this issue might influence not just voter turnout, but the overall results as well.
For sure.
Okay, so abortion access, clearly a big one, but let's switch gears for a second and talk about the economy. Because according to the Emerson poll, the economy is the top issue for voters in most of those swing states we've been discussing. Which, I mean, I guess it's not all that surprising when you consider what's happening right now.
Right. The economy is often a major factor in presidential elections, and this year is no different. Voters are concerned about inflation, jobs, the cost of living. All understandable concerns.
Yeah, especially with everything that's been going on.
Yeah.
And when those economic anxieties are high, it tends to put the incumbent party in a vulnerable position.
Absolutely. People start looking for change.
Exactly. But there was one swing state where the economy took a backseat to other concerns. Arizona. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, Arizona, always keeping us on our toes. In that state, the top issue, according to the poll, is immigration.
Which makes sense given its location.
Right. It highlights how those local concerns can sometimes overshadow even the big national issues, especially in a border state like Arizona where, immigration has such a direct impact on people's lives.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that elections aren't just about those big national narratives we see in the headlines. They're about the everyday concerns of ordinary people.
Absolutely.
And those concerns can vary drastically from one place to the next.
For sure. But even when we zoom back out to that national picture, there are other factors we can analyze to get a sense of where voters stand, like favorability ratings.
Oh, favorability ratings, yeah. It's like checking the political temperature, seeing who's hot and who's not at any given moment. So let's dig into those favorability numbers a bit. What did the Emerson poll tell us about how voters feel about Harris and Trump this time around? Anything surprising?
Well, both candidates have their strengths and weaknesses, no surprise there. But it's really interesting to see how it varies from state to state. Like, Harris's favorability is pretty strong in places like Georgia, Michigan, and Wisconsin. But then it kind of dips a bit in Pennsylvania and Arizona.
Which, if you think about it, actually aligns pretty closely with her performance in those swing states that we were talking about earlier, right?
Exactly. It's like those numbers are reflecting the tight races we're seeing on the ground. And on the flip side, Trump's numbers show a similar pattern. Doing well in North Carolina and Pennsylvania, but facing some resistance, at least in terms of favorability, in Nevada and Georgia.
Okay, so again, kind of mirroring Harris's performance in those specific states. But here's where it gets really interesting. How do those numbers stack up against, say, President Biden's approval ratings, or even former President Obama's favorability? Because Emerson tracked those too, right?
They did. And it's super insightful because, Biden's approval ratings are actually a bit lower than Harris's favorability in most of those swing states.
That could be a problem for the Democrats, right? Doesn't a popular incumbent usually give their party's candidate a boost?
Usually, yes. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But then you've got Obama, whose favorability ratings are still incredibly high, like across the board.
Yeah.
Even surpassing both Harris and Trump in some cases.
Wow, talk about enduring popularity. I mean, it's been a while since he was in office, but people still love the guy.
They do, it's true. He's definitely still a political heavyweight. And that kind of popularity, that kind of legacy, could definitely sway some voters, especially those who maybe haven't quite made up their minds yet.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It'll be fascinating to see how much of a presence Obama has on the campaign trail in these final weeks. If they wheel him out, you know it's serious.
Absolutely. Strategic deployment of a political rock star. That's what that is.
Now, speaking of fascinating political dynamics, I gotta say, those gubernatorial approval ratings in the Emerson poll really threw me for a loop. Some real head scratchers in there, especially considering how close everything else is.
Oh, tell me about it. Those gubernatorial races are like a whole other layer of intrigue on top of the already intense presidential election.
Right. Like in Georgia, for example, Republican Governor Brian Kemp has a surprisingly high approval rating, even though the state itself is pretty much a toss-up in the presidential race.
It's wild, isn't it? Almost like voters are separating their feelings about national politics from their views on local leadership.
Exactly. It just goes to show you can't underestimate the complexity of voters' decision-making processes. They're not always voting along party lines. They're thinking about the specific context, the individual candidates, and the issues that matter most to them at every single level of government.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And it's a great reminder that we shouldn't take anything for granted in an election this close. Every race matters. Every vote matters. Every issue matters.
It's going to be a wild ride to the finish line, that's for sure. But hey, that's what makes it so exciting, right?
Exactly. This is what democracy looks like, folks. Messy, unpredictable, and oh so important.
Well said. And for our listeners out there who are glued to this political drama just like we are, remember, knowledge is power. So stay informed, stay engaged, and for goodness sake, get out there and vote. Who knows, your vote might be the one that tips the scales.
That's right. Every single vote has the potential to make a difference, especially in an election this tight. So do your research, make your voice heard, and let's see what happens.
Couldn't agree more. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the latest Emerson College polling data. Thanks for joining us as we try to make sense of this wild and unpredictable election season.
It's been a pleasure. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep those thinking caps on.
And remember, no matter who you're rooting for, we're all in this together. See you next time.